In 1945, Muhammad Ali, not that Muhammad Ali, found a treasure trove of texts buried in this town near the Nile. The actual texts come from about 350, although they are copies of older texts. And they were buried in kind of the low desert in a sealed pot. There's not much we know about who buried them, why they buried them, and we wouldn't have known anything about them except they were discovered in Upper Egypt. There are 52 texts, some of which had been mentioned in some of these other early Christian writings or known from copies, but some of them were completely new finds, documents that had never been known about. Some of them are sayings gospels, many of them sayings of Jesus, just a list of sayings attributed to Jesus. Others are narrative gospels, much like the gospels we have in the New Testament, supposedly telling things about Jesus' life. And there are others that are more philosophical treatises, speculating on the nature of reality or the existence of the universe. And so essentially what Nag Hammadi does is provide us with a collection of texts that are Gnostics in their own words, which allowed people to have better insight into the beliefs, the practices of this group, as opposed to just having what early Orthodox mainstream Christians had said about it. I mentioned earlier that one of the challenges that exists with Gnosticism is it's unclear where it came from. So was Gnosticism an outgrowth of Christianity? Was it a non-Christian movement that latched onto some Christian ideas and that drew other Christians into it? There are those examples of Gnosticism outside of Christianity. So perhaps Christian Gnostics drew on Gnostic ideas already present in Roman culture and then, developed and changed in that way. The Gnostic text of Nag Hammadi and others appears, though, to come from a time after Christianity. One aspect of Gnosticism that may suggest or may have helped the development of Christian Gnosticism is the pre-Christian Redeemer myth. So there is this belief that a cosmic human, a supernatural being, descended to the earth to bring about the salvation of human beings. And so it's quite possible that some of these early Christians leaning towards Gnosticism took this myth and then explained it or used it to explain Jesus. Or maybe Gnostics had this belief and then Christianized it as they heard about Jesus. But somehow this connection with this Redeemer and Jesus, now quite different than when we talk about as Christians, Jesus as Redeemer. This is more a supernatural type of approach instead of Jesus becoming fully a human being. What we do see, however, is that Gnosticism, Christian Gnosticism, does appear to be a combination of Platonic philosophy, Judaism, or at least a mystical strain of Judaism, and Christianity. Right? There's elements of all of these that come through here, but it is unclear which came first. It's quite possible, and one scholar has suggested, that prior to Christianity, perhaps there was a Gnostic way of thinking that was really kind of unsystematic. It was just kind of a general thought as opposed to a really concrete way of thinking. And that with the arrival of stories of Jesus as Christians spread throughout the empire, Gnostics latched onto that and created the Christian form of Gnosticism that becomes the movement of Gnosticism. And so there's kind of this dual origin and kind of assimilation that takes place. Despite not being able to say much about where Gnosticism came from, there are some things that we can say about some characteristics of Gnosticism. First, Gnostics tended to be preoccupied with the question of evil. Specifically, the question of why evil existed. Which, of course, is a perennial problem for any monotheistic type of faith. If God is God, why does evil exist? Well, for many Gnostics, their response was to suggest that there were evil divine beings. Now, not like God and Satan, right? Satan is a created being in Christian theology, right? He's less than God. We're talking about God, divine beings that would be on equal levels. And so there's this idea that there were evil divine beings, and they're responsible for evil. And also, Gnostics believed that evil was represented in the material world. And material things are the physical manifestation of evil. Now, because of that, right, physical world being a manifestation of evil, many felt a sense of alienation from the world. Right? They had these spiritual desires, these spiritual longings, but they're caught in a physical type of existence. And with the world being the manifestation of evil, what is there to look for and be hopeful about this evil physical world? But perhaps there is salvation. Salvation from this evil material world through secret gnosis, through secret knowledge. So, ultimately, for Gnostics, salvation involved not freedom from sin, but freedom from ignorance, freedom from a lack of knowledge. And so this is what is salvation, knowledge, often believed to be passed down from a teacher to disciples and not generally available to all. And so with respect to these ideas, Gnostics often had a very dualistic view of the universe. The two forces, right? Good and evil. And then anything material or physical was evil, and spirituality was good. So you have good and evil, physical and spiritual. Not only were some Gnostics not content with talking about these divine beings, they even created these rather elaborate hierarchies of divine beings. And so the divine world consisted of all sorts of different levels of spiritual beings that ultimately come from one being, the fullness, sometimes referred to in the Greek as pleroma. So originally there was the pleroma, but gradually a variety of divine beings had developed. And often these were connected in male-female pairs, working together. Not only were there different levels of spiritual beings, there were different levels of human beings. There were, essentially for many Gnostics, three levels. There were those who had a divine spark, that were destined for salvation. There were, secondly, those who, through good works or through the church, could experience salvation. Right? So there's a divine spark, they're going to experience salvation. Others are, well, if they have the help of the church, or if they do enough good works, they could be saved. But then there was the third group, those that were completely connected with the material world and were lost. Salvation would not take place for them. With the dualism of physical and spiritual, evil and good, often that manifested itself in a variety of ethical or moral ways. Some suggested that because the spirit is inherently good, there is nothing that you could do physically that would somehow damage your spirit. So engage in whatever sorts of behaviors you would like, because it is not going to affect your spirit. Others argued, the ascetic view argued, because the flesh is evil, you do not want to give it any sort of pleasure. And so you need to punish the body almost, so that you can free the spirit. But one thing to remain constantly, or one thing that was true about this, is that there was not one Gnostic group. Ferguson, of course, talks about the variety and focuses particularly on the Valentinian group. But there were a wide variety of Gnostic groups. And so there wasn't a completely one set of principles, but there were some similarities as we talked about. Just to kind of give you some examples, there was a group, you don't need to necessarily get this down, it's not going to appear, these names are not going to appear on an exam, for example. There was a group known as the Cainites. Cainites. Now, they looked at it this way. If the physical world is evil, then whoever is responsible for the creation of the physical world must be evil. Because he's created evil material, evil matter. Now, in the Bible, since Yahweh is presented as the creator, Yahweh must be evil. But Yahweh is presented in the Bible as good. So it must be that all the good people in the Bible are actually evil, and all the evil people in the Bible are actually good. And who would be the most primal evil of all, if not Cain, who commits the first murder? So the Cainites, right? They looked to Cain and some other individuals that were actually good, including people like Judas. There was another group known as the Ophlites, from the Greek word for serpent. Why do you think they might, in a Christian system, revere the serpent? What might the serpent have done that Gnostics would have said, that's a pretty good thing?
Give him knowledge of good people.
Right? So because the serpent offers them knowledge, he is looked upon as being a positive influence, right? And so, no wonder you see these early Christians writing about the bizarre rituals and beliefs, because you look at some of them as Christians, you say, how would you ever get there? But through their logic, so to speak, they got through there. Another example of this would be this example of a Gnostic creation narrative from the secret book according to John. Now remember, not all Gnostics shared this. Right? This is just one example of how the Gnostics talked about the creation of the world. In the beginning was the first principle, or the fullness. It was perfect. It was ultimate. It was omnipotent. The first principle is a solitary intellect, though. It's the only thing that exists. And the only thing that it can do is to think about itself, because that is all that exists. And by thinking about itself, the fullness created a physical representation, an emanation that becomes objectified. And so thus creating a second principle. And so as these reflections of these beings continue, all sorts of other beings are created by their thinking about themselves. Each level, however, is less than the others. So the second principle is less than the first, and further on. Many of these emanations had names like truth, wisdom, right? So they're connected with a lot of principles. At one point, one of these beings, again, this is the version of the secret book according to John, Yaldabaoth creates the world. The word means child of chaos. There's a lot of similarities people have pointed out between this myth and Plato's creation myth as well. And so this child of chaos creates the world. And then further on, the world is then populated by human beings. Some of the higher eons or emanations try to recover some of the power that the child of chaos had stolen to create the world. And so this power is then distributed in humanity. And so there's this conflict between the evil spirits of deception and those beings that want to bring about knowledge. One of the final parts of the narrative is when a heavenly Savior, who is to awaken humanity, arrives to release the divine spark. So the Savior would acquaint people with the first principle and free them from their bondage to the material body. And so in many respects, the idea of this heavenly Savior, and also some other ideas reflected in Jesus, suggests that Jesus did not physically come in the flesh, okay, because then he would be evil. Nor, in some versions of the Jesus narrative, does Jesus actually die. There's one version where, as Jesus is being led to be crucified, he switches places with Simon of Cyrene. And it is Simon who is hung on the cross as Jesus is looking on and laughing because the people think that they are crucifying Jesus. There's a lot more we could say about Gnosticism. It's a very diverse and complex field, and more, of course, has been coming out in the past couple decades as people have been studying those Gnostic texts.